All right, good morning, as always, to everyone for tuning into the talk. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Sidharth Kaushal, who's the Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, as it's known by its acronym. His CGSR lecture this morning is titled Thinking About Sub-Threshold Competition, How to Constrain an Opponent Short of War. This talk shares a title with a recent paper by Dr. Kaushal, which I'm sure he's going to elaborate on during the presentation, and I'm going to put a link to that paper in the chat function after I conclude my opening remarks here. But to set the stage for this presentation for the audience here at the lab tuning in, I'll just say this is another in a series of CGSR talks we've had recently looking at the challenges of integrated deterrence, both sort of in an immediate setting and then within the longer term parameters of great power competition. The immediate, as most people would be aware in terms of sub-threshold competition, as Dr. Kaushal will talk about, is right now in front of us in Ukraine, as Russia seeks in its conception of local war to avoid drawing in the United States and NATO, and the United States and its allies seek to bolster Ukrainian warfighting capabilities without escalating to an out-and-out war with Russia. But this is also this problem of sub-threshold conflict has been a long-standing problem in strategic competition. This area of competition short of war. We've been through it a lot intellectually over the last decade with these debates about countering hybrid warfare and little green men, and what we saw with Russia in Ukraine in 2014, what we've been seeing, the activities by China in the South China Sea. But this topic, I think, is also familiar to anyone who studied great power competition throughout history, throughout the Cold War, and throughout sort of competition between powers historically in warfare. So I think we're very fortunate to have this speaker with us here today, both to tackle sort of the topical, the what's in the news, but also sort of the eternal problems of warfare, sort of all in one and great presentation. So let me say a little bit about the speaker. Dr. Kaushal's research at RUSI covers the impact of technology on maritime doctrine in the 21st century, and the role of sea power in particular in a state's grand strategy. He holds a doctorate in international relations from the London School of Economics, where his research examined the ways in which strategic culture shapes the contours of a nation's grand strategy. The ground rules, as always for these presentations, Dr. Kaushal is going to deliver his remarks for about 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor up for a broader discussion. Please raise your hand electronically using the WebEx function. Please submit your questions to me in the chat function so we can get the discussion rolling quickly once his remarks conclude. And we'll try to get as many of your questions and comments as possible in the time allocated. So Dr. Kaushal, thank you so much for being with us here today. Over to you. I'm going to go ahead and plug a link to your paper in the chat function. Thank you so much.
Well, I mean, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to everyone at LLNL for the opportunity to speak to you today. It really is an honor. So what I'd like to discuss with you today is effectively how we define the contours of sub-threshold competition and how we link sub-threshold competition to our wider understanding of competition more generally. You know, the inspiration for both this talk and the paper on which it was based was the growing prominence of the discussion of sub-threshold competition on the one hand, you know, whether it's the US's most recently published national defense strategy or rather the published annexes to it, or the British Army's British Armed Forces, I should say, integrated operating concept, which talk about the need for an integrated approach to persistent campaigning below the level of warfare. The sub-threshold is just one of those ubiquitous topics. Perhaps to loop back, effectively the problem with the way we describe sub-threshold competition is that we tend to, I'd say, make three mistakes. The first is that we begin with an instrument-based typology or an understand constitutes sub-threshold involves committees like cyber capabilities or special forces. This is both a typological error because it's not obvious that certain instruments are necessarily viewed as being above or below the threshold by all actors at all times. One can think of cases where states have engaged in limited covert or overt direct kinetic action against each other without this being considered above the threshold. Equally, one can think of cases where, non-kinetic tools, sanctions, for example, have been a precursor for war. Japan in 1941 being an obvious example in this respect. The second sort of lacuna in the way we think about sub-threshold competition is we tend to treat it as an end in itself. And I think this, and in many ways disconnected from our wider lexicon about competition. So, if an action in the South China Sea or Eastern Europe challenges credibility, that's viewed as a strategic end in itself for a it's I sort of try to flesh out in this paper is that, well, effectively, in order to deliver a sort of integrated deterrence, particularly in the sub-threshold space, we require two things. Firstly, an understanding of how the sub-threshold space fits with the other elements of competition, particularly what we might consider above threshold. So what might be described as the fight phase of activity in the British Armed Forces integrated operating concept. The second is that a shared lexicon of campaign objectives ought to be delineated in terms of ends rather than means, both in order to create a lexicon that is not so specific to any instrument that it cannot be shared across both a joint force and a wider government, and just as a matter of typological clarity. Otherwise you fall into the lacuna of believing, for example, that, as I said, any challenge to credibility is an end in itself, which might, in many ways, elide over the very different nature, very specific sub-threshold challenges that one faces, and the different responses that they might require. So to begin with, I'd like to talk about how we think about the sub-threshold space in its relationship to the other phases of strategic competition. And basically the case that I make is that there is no really meaningful definition of what constitutes sub-threshold activity. So for example, we discuss sub-threshold acts in terms of their relative ambiguity, for example, but often ambiguity is a choice. Think of, for example, Soviet pilots flying supposedly North Korean jets against the US Air Force during the Korean War. This wasn't an ambiguous act. Both sides recognized what was going on quite early on. They chose to effectively ignore it because it served a wider shared strategic objective of managing escalation and managing competition at a specific level. Even relatively ambiguous tools like cyber attacks are increasingly being attributed at fairly rapid rates. The second argument that's often made with regards to how we define the sub-threshold is activity short of direct kinetic action. But again, this is a definition that sort of obscures more than it clarifies. You can consider, examples of limited kinetic action being carried out by states against one another. The US Marine Corps facing off against Wagner Group in Syria relatively recently, Russian and Turkish forces engaging each other, both each other and their proxies in Syria and in Libya, without crossing the threshold into conflict. Equally, you can think of cases where decidedly non-kinetic tools became a precondition for direct military escalation. The obvious example that comes to mind here, as I mentioned, was that of Japan before 1941, which views the sanctions on its energy supplies, the embargoes on its energy supplies, as being a precondition for war. In other words, a decidedly non-kinetic tool, it becomes a precondition for activity, or its use becomes a precondition for activity above the threshold of warfare. So how do we get around this? How do we define the sub-threshold space? And what I'd argue is we make an error in assuming that there are objective thresholds that particularly our opponents have found ways around. We treat them as a real thing. Instead, what I'd argue is the boundaries, the contours of what defines the sub-threshold space are intersubjectively defined. So in other words, they're a product of a tacit consensus amongst both actors in a strategic competition. And B, they're the product of a parallel competition to shape boundaries in a way that favors one actor and not another. There are always tacit rules to competition, right? You have to go back, and they always favor one party. To go back to, the example of Korea, the decision that what happened in Korea between China, the North Koreans, and the US and the ROK on the one on each side would be restrained to Korea. That, for example, escalation would not be carried over the border into Chinese territory, was effectively a rule set that all sides tacitly agreed upon, but which asymmetrically favored one party. The ability to shape the rules of competition, and in particular, the ability to shape what falls within the contours of sub-threshold activity, is something that is A, the product of tacit consensus, and B, is very much the product, to a great extent, of how each competitive actor uses those tools which are primarily designed to operate above the level of, or at higher levels of conflict, including, for example, nuclear assets. So let me give you a couple of examples. Take the Indo-Pakistani border. Pakistan engages in what we might broadly define as sub-threshold activity on its side of the border, proxy warfare, for example. But its ability to do so without, for example, without fearing a conventional escalation on a large scale by the Indian side, is shaped in no small part by the way it's postured its nuclear arsenal. It maintains a large and robust arsenal, particularly of tactical nuclear weapons, and it has, to a certain extent, devolved command and control authorities to lower level commanders. So in other words, the reason what's happening on the Indian side of the border is defined as sub-threshold rather than being a base very much above the threshold and a basis for large-scale conventional action is because of the way in which tools that would not typically be considered in any way, shape, or form part of sub-threshold competition have been used by the Pakistani side to define the contours of the sub-threshold space. Equally, for their part, if you look at Indian efforts to develop limited war strategies like the cold start doctrine, which are usable in a way that makes tactical nuclear use difficult to contemplate, if this represents an effort to find a way around that around that conundrum to make India's conventional power, which generally exceeds that of Pakistan, more usable in a way that doesn't immediately lead to wider escalation, and thereby to shrink the contours of what counts as sub-threshold activity by making a much larger spectrum of activities a basis for higher level conventional escalation. And you see this very much in other theaters as well. Would the North Korean decision in 2010 to sink the ROK's corvette, the Shonan, or to shell Yongpyong Island be regarded as beneath the threshold if, for example, North Korea didn't have both a burgeoning WMD capability and, of course, enough artillery massed on the other side of the 38th parallel to do significant damage to Seoul in particular in the event of conventional escalation? Would equally many of Iran's activities in its region be considered below the threshold if escalation above the threshold, or if treating them as acts of open war would not also involve a degree of escalation vis-a-vis Iran that raised the risks of, for example, the Straits of Hormuz being closed, or Iran's relatively large cruise and ballistic missile arsenal being used against critical national infrastructure of states, particularly in the Gulf. So the point I'm driving at is that in a large measure, the contest to define the sub-threshold space is the product of is a parallel contest, a contest to define the boundaries of the contest, so to speak, which is in no small measure driven by the tools that a state uses very much above the threshold of warfare, and which, moreover, follows some fairly predictable dynamics, which is to say that generally the conventionally weaker actor has an incentive to expand the dimensions of the sub-threshold space as far as it can to include a larger and larger set of activities within it without triggering conventional warfare, because those are the areas in which it enjoys or it may enjoy relative comparative strengths. And typically, it utilizes the threat of catastrophic escalation in some form, whether it's the use of tactical nuclear weapons, closing Hormuz, shelling Seoul, in order to expand the contours of the sub-threshold space. Equally, the conventionally stronger actor and the strategically stronger actor in general has strong incentives to minimize the contours of the sub-threshold space, and strong incentives, therefore, to look for more flexible, usable conventional force doctrines to make its threats to link certain actions to effectively above, or define certain actions as being effectively above threshold activity and therefore a casus belli, effectively credible. So there's a parallel contest to define the boundaries of the sub-threshold space. That, however, is not the only sort of factor that drives how we think about the contours of what falls within the sub-threshold strategic space. Another factor we might consider is the general direction of travel in the relations between two nations. I mean, consider this, for example. In 1972, the Nixon administration can contemplate something like mining Haiphong Harbor in Vietnam and risking potentially killing both Soviet and Chinese sailors without necessarily worrying that this will be treated as an act of war rather than an act of competition. His predecessors can't necessarily do that. And the reason, of course, is that improving relations with both the USSR and China give all three parties a stake in their relationship with one another, a stake in, by extension, sort of raising the threshold of what might put them in a state of open war, and by extension, a reason to expand the boundaries of what falls within the sub-threshold space. So by way of a counterexample, and this is one I've gone back to a couple of times, so I won't sort of relitigate it too many times. You know, the Japanese-American example in 1941 stands as a counterexample where an activity that's decidedly non-kinetic is a basis for conventional escalation because Japanese leaders believe that their relationship with America is broken down irrevocably, and to tarry any further is only to create a basis for a war on much less favorable terms 6 months down the line when embargoes have had their impact. So the general direction of travel has a significant impact on what states are willing to treat as being effectively part of competition rather than war fighting. And we see this today, right? Russia and Turkey, for example, have, Turkey has shot down Russian jets. Russia and Turkey have almost certainly killed each other's personnel in both Syria and in Libya. And yet, simultaneously, you've seen cooperation between the two nations on a range of activities, whether it's arms sales, gas pipelines, investments in things like shipbuilding and nuclear infrastructure. Because the two states have a stake in the relationship they are building, they have an incentive to both segment certain things from the wider relationship and to expand the remit of the sub-threshold space to include things that might, and activities that might previously have been regarded as, or under different circumstances might be regarded as being absolutely and unequivocally above the threshold. The third factor I'd like to talk about is more internal to individual actors within a competition. And that's the impact of things like organizational culture and operational codes, the philosophical beliefs that underpin actors' ideas regarding what is instrumentally useful, what is instrumentally viable, and how actions might be interpreted by their counterparts. An example here might be the 1996 Taiwan Straits crisis, right? China conducts a series of missile tests off Taiwan using missiles with dummy warheads, something it feels will be understood as a clear-cut act of sub-threshold coercive diplomacy. The United States views this very differently, and the crisis very much, very nearly sort of boils over into something very much above the threshold before one side backs down. The operational codes, the organizational culture of the PLA just fundamentally differs from that of its counterpart. And we can think of ways in which decision makers and large bodies of decision makers may differ across countries in ways that impact how they define the competitive space. For example, individuals or organizations that view international intercourse between nations in more transactional terms might be more comfortable with the idea of limited competition existing alongside cooperation in other areas. Alternatively, instrumental beliefs, for example, the idea that force, if it must be used decisively. You might think of the Powell doctrine in this respect, might incline actors to view the sub-threshold space or to view peace and war in much more binary terms. There is no instrumental basis for persistent competition. Either the instruments of state power are used decisively or not at all. So I think the third factor we might consider how factors like organizational culture and philosophical operational codes condition how individual actors within a competition view the sub-threshold space. But the salient point is this, that inevitably the rule set one determines in terms of what falls within the ambit of general competition will asymmetrically favor one party over another, because, for example, as I said, a rule set that precludes a conventionally stronger actor from using its material capabilities in decisive fashion might favor the conventionally weaker one. One that defines the geographical boundaries of the competition in a certain way might favor one actor over another. Korea being a good example, where defining the boundaries of the conflict as excluding the Chinese mainland, asymmetrically favored or the Chinese and North Korean side, and that the competition to define this rule set is a sort of a meta competition that states are carrying out alongside alongside an actual competition to achieve specific objectives. So that's kind of the first proposition I make in the paper and in this discussion. So where does that take us? Well, I'd say that takes us to a second question, which is, okay, we accept that, states compete to define the sub-threshold space in certain ways, but that doesn't necessarily tell us much about what they can achieve in this space. What are the goals towards which sub-threshold competition is geared? It can't be just an end in itself. And this, I think, is critical, and I think a clear ends-based typology here is quite critical, because we often, in a number of policy documents, I go back to the integrated operating concept in Britain, talk about persistent campaigning as a feature of international relation, or rather of strategic competition, without a clear typology of what campaign goals might look like. So I kind of lay out four sort of broad campaign objectives that one can achieve in what might generally be defined as the sub-threshold space. Not necessarily because I think that this is an exhaustive list, but more as a sort of a first cut and a sort of an illustration of what an ends-based typology might look like. And they are strategic erosion, enabling a partner that is in the fight phase of activity, preparation for a fight on favorable terms, and finally, costly signaling and brinkmanship. So the central sort of unifying thread of these four campaign goals and the way in which I've chosen them is that they have no obvious relationship to a particular arm of government or the military. In other words, precisely because they are ends-based rather than means-based, they can create a lexicon which is shared across very dissimilar organizations and allows them to frame their activities. So let's begin with the first, strategic erosion, which is perhaps the sub-threshold objective that has gained the most sort of attention in recent years and in recent discussions of subthreshold activity. So effectively, it implies the long-term erosion of an opponent's either capabilities or psychological resolve. It's distinct, however, from coercion in the sense that it aims not at a specific objective per se, but rather at the diminution of an opponent's capacity for action in the long term. And, as an aside, and perhaps for discussion after this, one might think about the sub-threshold campaign we are waging vis Russia in those terms. One often hears the question of how the sort of conflict in Ukraine ends, or how Russia can be made to meet a certain set of conciliatory sort of objectives, peace terms, which is one way of looking at it as, coercive diplomacy. But there is another way of looking at this, which is for as long as Russia is there, it blunts the one tool of state power, which it still has, military power, and effectively ensures the diminution of its capacity for long-term action. But the basic premise of strategic erosion is that tactical success or failure do not necessarily translate into strategic failure. A stalemate, for example, can still be a strategic success if it contributes to the overall erosion of an opponent's capabilities. And we see this in, for example, the East Asia most starkly. Take, for example, the PLA Air Forces probing around Taiwan in its air defense identification zone. It hasn't necessarily established any positive aim in one sense of the term. It's not coerced Taiwan into doing anything. It's not necessarily sort of forced concessions. But what we often overlook is that over the year 2020, the Taiwanese Air Force spent $900 million on scrambling jets to intercept, which is just around 10% of the Taiwanese overall defense budget. Or to take another example, in the South China Sea, there have been a number of indecisive clashes between China's maritime militia, its Coast Guard, and Vietnamese authorities, which have not necessarily achieved a positive end in the sense of coercion, but they have cost Vietnam about $1 billion per annum of lost revenue. And we should say that this is not necessarily an exclusively non-Western approach. I'd say an obvious and very useful example of strategic erosion might be the Reagan doctrine vis-a-vis the USSR. When one thinks of the subcomponents of the Reagan administration's grand strategy, persistent and sustained pressure on Soviet proxies, attempts to undercut the Soviet economic performance in areas like energy exports, and finally the placement of pretty high visibility military assets, either real or hypothetical, ground launched cruise missiles in the case of real assets, but hypothetical assets or potential assets in the case of things like the strategic defense, the SDI. The cumulative effect of all these things was actually convergent. It was to force the Soviet economy, as we all know, into a race that it could not run. Now, I'd say that's very instructive for two reasons. Firstly, and this goes back to the point about an ends-based typology, the existence of an objective eroding the capacity for competition of a state that lacked the material basis for it meant that a range of tools from from proxy warfare to the deployment of assets or the development of assets which might not typically be associated with sub-threshold warfare, high visibility space missile defense capabilities, could be planned in a convergent way. This wasn't necessarily because of an organizational innovation. It was because there was a shared lexicon of what was being attempted, the convergent objective towards which goals were, towards which individual capabilities were working, which framed the roles of individual capabilities within the contours of this this particular sub-threshold campaign aimed at strategic erosion. I would also point out that the tools that served this particular objective, as I said, high visibility assets, were not necessarily tools that we would normally associate with the sub-threshold space, including potential capabilities like SDI. They were also perhaps, perhaps crucially, it underscores perhaps a mismatch between the ways in which certain capabilities can be useful. To go back to the example of SDI, operationally, arguably, it may not have proven, well, probably it certainly wouldn't have proven useful or feasible in a conflict scenario. But as a competitive tool, it was exceedingly useful. We might think of, how, in that vein, we might think of how capabilities like, or how we might view capabilities like hypersonics in modern competition. Do they necessarily add that much strategic utility over other forms of long-range precision fires? Maybe, maybe not. That's a discussion worth having. But do they have a forcing function in terms of forcing resource expenditure and by extension strategic erosion? Arguably. And so the ways in which we generate capabilities might actually, particularly capabilities we don't necessarily associate with sub-threshold competition, more expensive, visible assets, might actually benefit from a sort of a dual track assessment of quality. Assets that may be useful that may be highly useful above the threshold of warfare may not contribute to to sort of persistent campaigns aimed at things like strategic erosion, and vice versa. So that's my sort of first category of sub-threshold campaign. The second I look at is enabling a partner in the fight phase of activities. So enabling a partner that is actually conducting high in tempo, high intensity military activities. And if ever there was a timely there was a good time to discuss that, right? Arguably, much of what we've seen sort of NATO do in Ukraine, enabling the Ukrainians through the provision of everything from or Western nations have enabled the Ukrainians with the provision of everything from armaments to ISR capabilities, falls into that category. But it's not necessarily entirely new. To use a slightly older example, we might think of Britain's role in the Russo-Japanese War, right? Britain is not party to the conflict officially. It does nonetheless do a number of things. For example, the Royal Navy shadows the Russian Baltic Fleet, causing it to change its deployment patterns and therefore causing it to take more time to get to the Asia Pacific. The British government denies the Russians coaling stations along the way, and the British proceed to actually purchase warships that might have been utilized by the Russians to replace some of their losses in that conflict, or sort of prevail upon partners and allies to do so. Again, there's a convergent objective here, which is slowing down the Russian Baltic Fleet so that the Japanese can defeat a numerically superior Russian Navy in detail, first its Pacific Squadron and then the Baltic Fleet. And because there's an ends-based framework within which this fits, the roles of very disparate assets, from the Royal Navy to the authorities that manage coaling stations to the Foreign Office, fall into place. Again, not because of a top-down convergence or coordination. The British government at that time, in fact, most governments at that time, are not necessarily sort of nearly as bureaucratically complex as their modern counterparts are today. They don't have that capacity for coordinated action in the sense of top-down directive. What they do have is a shared lexicon that can be understood by different elements of the state in roughly the same terms. That takes me to the third one, the third campaign objective. Preparation for a fight on favorable terms. So this is, arguably quite similar to strategic erosion in the sense that actually, with the only the only difference being that rather than being a substitute for high intensity conflict, it represents a prelude to it. And, again, examples abound from, Cardinal Richelieu's decades of proxy warfare against the Habsburg Empire before he finally commits France's forces to direct conflict on favorable terms, all the way through to more modern examples. You might, to go to the Sino-Indian border, consider how competition for key hills or choke points within the valleys on that particular mountainous border are sort of perceived by both parties, which is to say that successful competition of particularly hills overlooking or mountains overlooking key road arteries is seen as setting the conditions for a fight on favorable terms if one need occur. And the final sort of campaign objective one can view, or within my framework at least, in sub-threshold competition, is costly signaling and brinkmanship. So, this is arguably, again, sort of one area where we perhaps have seen more attention paid than some of the others. And, examples abound, particularly when one actor faces a coalition where it feels that there are differential levels of commitment to either an alliance or a coalition amongst its individual members. You might think of, the rationale Khrushchev adopted during during the Berlin crisis, that effectively forcing the issue of Berlin's status would lead to schisms within the Western alliance. I mean, this is quite, in some ways quite intuitive to students of political science, for example. It's long been understood that, heristetics, wedge issues can be seized upon by an actor in a way that splits a coalition, and inducing a crisis under certain scenarios may be seen as effectively a form of political heristhetic. So that's kind of my broad typology of sub-threshold competition and the ways in which we might sort of frame campaign objectives in a way that can be understood across the various arms of government. It's by no means not an exhaustive typology, but what it offers is, as I said, a sort of an instrument agnostic framework that hopefully I would hope is a basis for subsequent discussion. So, I mean, that leads me to the last bit of my discussion, which is what's new, if anything, because we've talked quite a bit of history so far. Is there actually anything new under the sun? So I'd argue that in many ways, the fundamental dynamics of sub-threshold competition and the ways in which it fits within a state's wider grand strategy remain quite consistent. Where I'd say there are certain trends which however, I do believe that there are trends which do deserve our attention in terms of how specific aspects of it may change in the 21st century. And I just draw your attention to a few. The first is that most actors today, most great powers, have strong incentives to define the sub-threshold space in relatively broad terms. And that's true for a few reasons. The first is that we live in we exist in what might, albeit roughly be defined as a sort of a tripolar military order, right? Where you have sort of the West facing off to a certain degree with Russia in Europe, and elements of it, the United States specifically, doing the same with China in the Indo-Pacific with its partners. Now, in any context where you have this sort of configuration of power, and the side that sits out a direct high-intensity conflict tends to be the strategic winner. And, this goes back to the Peloponnesian War, right? The great winner of the Peloponnesian War arguably is the Persian Great King, who sits out the fight between Athens and Sparta, subsidizes the weaker party, and then comes in at the very end to effectively dictate the king's peace on favorable terms, something he can do. Modern leaders have grasped this dynamic as well. You might consider how Stalin, for example, in the build-up to World War II, effectively tries to set up a bidding war for his attentions between both Hitler and the Western allies, and in diverting Hitler westwards by effectively reaching a modus vivendi with Hitler, thinks that he can initiate a long strategic competition in the West, from which the Soviet Union, as the sole intact power, can emerge to effectively dictate the peace. Obviously, that logic depended on a long war in the West, which doesn't materialize, so that strategy rather falls apart. But I think the logic generally is sound, that in any sort of broadly triangular dynamic, most powers have incentives to avoid long, costly engagements, because they will, any two powers do, because that will only be to the benefit of the third. So that's one factor. In addition to that, we might think of factors like relative economic interdependence, certainly between actors like the US and China, but also even with economically less capable actors, Russia, for example, admittedly purely because of a narrow sort of set of resources, and nuclear dynamics as well, as giving all parties an incentive to expand their definitions of what falls beneath the threshold of warfare. The second factor I would point to is that of network effects and bottlenecks. So one of the interesting characteristics of international dynamics in the 21st century is returns to scale, particularly when it comes to functional networks. And an obvious example of this would be SWIFT as an interbanking sort of mechanism, right? The more people use it, the more people want to use it. But that, of course, creates opportunities for relatively weaponized interdependence, perhaps which have not been fully exploited in the contemporary context, but which nonetheless exist. In a similar vein, we might, for example, think of China's relative or potential burgeoning dominance of some of the most commercially viable ports that operate sort of a good chunk of the world's maritime shipping. The more people use these assets, the more they are likely to use these assets, and this appears to be a general sort of almost you might say theoretical principle of how networks operate, but also biological corollary, a general principle of strategic competition in a networked era. The greater returns to scale become, the greater the centrality of certain actors in certain networks becomes, whether that's the movement of goods or the movement of information, and the greater the opportunities to effectively leverage this, much in the way the British did with their centrality to coaling stations during the Russo-Japanese War. The third factor I'd like to discuss is the emergence of a defense-dominated operating environment. And we're seeing this to some degree in Ukraine, where an actor with theoretically operating at a strategic deficit by any sense of the term, whether that's GDP or military budget, is holding off a much stronger actor using a range of cheap asymmetrical tools, whether that's ATGMs or UAVs, or, as we've seen this last night, cruise missile strikes. But it would be a mistake to think that's just a product of the current environment, or the current operating environment in the Ukraine. To give you we've seen similar dynamics in Yemen, where the Houthis have drawn the Saudi-led coalition into a long urban slog, and have moreover been able to use increasingly precision strike assets, to which access is increasingly democratized, partially because of great power patrons support, Iran in this case, to jeopardize the Saudi homeland, we can see perhaps plumes of that dynamic in the Indo-Pacific, where Taiwan could use some of these same capabilities to really make an intervention against it by the PLA a costly affair. If the costs of direct conflict with a smaller actor rise, on the one hand, we are likely to see greater incentives to operate indirectly by states because, well, direct action is potentially a recipe for large costs, for greater and greater costs. But also by extension, sort of greater incentives for indirect competition and perhaps expansively defined indirect competition between major powers, and that's what we are seeing today, right? In the Eastern European conflict, where, you know, as Michael mentioned at the beginning, both sides have arguably adopted a definition of competition that is far more expansive, that includes a far wider range of activities than perhaps they would have been willing to conceive of let's say 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago, or indeed for large parts of the Cold War. So that's kind of my broad framework for understanding the subthreshold space, which I've laid out in my paper and I've tried to sort of summarize in this discussion. I will wrap up there, and I look forward to your questions. And thanks again for the opportunity to speak to you today. It really is a pleasure.